Today we're going to be making this delicious pumpkin pie. Hello bread machine lovers, bakers, homemakers. Welcome to Butterfly Meadows Homestead. Your hearts are warmed and bodies are nourished. From baking and cooking to canning and preserving, we love all things homesteading. So today we're going to be making a pumpkin pie, and we are going to start with a pie pumpkin. You can also make this recipe using canned pumpkin. If you have access to one of these sugar pie pumpkins, or a small pumpkin like this, then you can also make it from that fresh pumpkin. And I'm going to show you what to do with the pumpkin if that's what you choose to do. But if you don't want to do it from scratch like this and you want to use the canned pumpkin, I will have timestamps in the description below so you can skip ahead to where you use the canned pumpkin or the pumpkin puree. So the first thing we have to do is get the pumpkin puree out of this pumpkin. Now, pumpkin skins are very tough, and we also want to get our pumpkin puree out of the pumpkin without adding liquid to it. So what we're going to do is we are going to bake the pumpkin and then take the pumpkin flesh out of the pumpkin shell. There are two ways you can do this. I'm going to cut this pumpkin in half. If you don't want to do that, you could also bake this pumpkin whole, but you would want to pierce holes in it so that the steam can escape. But what we're going to do is we're going to slice this pumpkin in half. And then I'm going to lay it on this baking sheet. And you don't have to do this, but I have this wire rack here to help allow the liquid to drain as the pumpkin is baking. The first thing we want to do is carefully cut this pumpkin in half, and we're going to remove the seeds. You definitely want to be careful as you're cutting your pumpkin in half. Get yourself a sharp knife and carefully cut the pumpkin in half. And you want to remove all of the seeds and most of the stringy texture you see in here that's holding the seeds inside the pumpkin. And you might want to save your seeds because they are delicious when you roast them. So we're going to place this in our 350-degree oven until it becomes tender. And then we will take it out and remove the pumpkin flesh. Our pumpkin has been in the oven about an hour and a half or so, and it is ready to take out. So now we're ready to get the meat out of the pumpkin skin. I'm just using a fork because it's hot. You could wait till it cools and then remove it. That way you could just touch it with your hands. But I'm a little pushed for time, so I'm going to try to do it while it's hot. And it just comes right out of the skin with no problem. It just comes right out of the skin. Easy peasy. Now our next step is to puree the pumpkin. Because like I mentioned earlier, pumpkin has quite a stringy texture, and we want to puree it so that we don't have that stringy texture in our pie. And you can put it in the blender Or I'm just going to use this stick blender, but you can put it in a blender if you want. Now that our pumpkin is pureed, we only need about a cup of pumpkin. Now, I want you to see that this pumpkin doesn't have a lot of water in it, and that's because I baked it and I also put it on the wire rack, so that helped any moisture that came out of the pumpkin to dry. If your pumpkin is watery, has a lot of water in it, you're going to want to strain that water off by putting the pumpkin in a sieve with a cheesecloth or some kind of a cotton towel and sitting it over a container and letting that water for about 30 minutes drain off, because you don't want really wet pumpkin that will mess up your pie. So you want to make sure that it's not watery at all. If it is, you're going to want to strain it. And we only need a cup for our pie. We only need a cup of this pumpkin. So I'm going to go ahead and measure this out. So there we have our 1 cup of pumpkin, and the rest of this, we can either freeze it if we want to save it long term, or we can put it in the fridge and keep it until our next pumpkin recipe. Probably some pumpkin bread. Now that we have our pumpkin ready, we are ready to put our pie together. This recipe is for 1 pumpkin pie. You can double it if you want to make 2. And I'm also using ingredients so that if you don't have, for example, pumpkin pie spice available, then you can use these individual spices. And also I'm using evaporated milk. You can use heavy cream in place of evaporated milk, but I know some countries you can't get heavy cream, and evaporated milk works great. And we need a 1/2 cup of evaporated milk, 1 cup of pumpkin puree, 1 tablespoon of butter. I warmed this in the microwave. And we have 3/4 of a cup of brown sugar, and you pack that into the cup when you're measuring it, and 2 eggs. And we're going to mix all of this together, and we're going to pour it into an unbaked pie shell. I did not make a homemade pie shell. Pie crusts are easy to make, and if you want to make your own pie crust, feel free. I just usually buy my pie crust instead of making them, so that's what I have here, is a store-bought 9-inch pie crust. Now here are the spices that we're using. I have here, and because I'm just making 1 pie, these measurements are like 1/8 or just a pinch of these ingredients. So here's 1/8 of black pepper. I do have 1 teaspoon of cinnamon, 1/8 of clove, ground clove, 1/8 of allspice, that's teaspoons, 1/8 teaspoon of ginger, and 1/8 teaspoon of nutmeg, and 1/8 of a teaspoon of salt. So those are the spices that we're using, and you can use any combination of spices you want. You don't have to particularly use those. You could just use pumpkin pie spice and just use 2 teaspoons or 1.5 teaspoons of pumpkin pie spice. So first we're going to put in our pumpkin. We're going to pour in our 1/2 cup of evaporated milk, our tablespoon of butter, our 3/4 of a cup of brown sugar. This is dark brown sugar. You can use light brown sugar. You can even use white sugar if you want. And we have 2 eggs. And our spices. Make sure it's all mixed together well, and we're going to pour this into our pie shell. I have my oven preheated to 400 degrees, and we're going to place this in the oven on the lower rack, and we're going to bake it at 400 degrees for 10 minutes. Then we're going to lower the temperature of the oven. We're going to lower the temperature of the oven to 350 and continue baking it until it's set, which will probably be around 40 minutes. Our pie baked for 10 minutes at 400 degrees and for about 45 minutes at 350 degrees. And you can tell your pie is done if it'll be raised up a little bit, and it kind of jiggles, but it's not it's not because it's wet on the inside. More like Jell-O would jiggle. It still has some solidity to it. And you can also stick a sharp knife in it. If it comes out clean, then you know it's done. Now, it's perfectly normal and expected that the pie will sink. It won't keep this raised up look. It'll sink down. We can't cut into it until it cools. So when it cools, we'll cut into it and show you what it looks like and do a taste test. Our pumpkin pie has cooled, and we're going to slice into it. It's important to let your pumpkin pie cool properly before you slice into it, because if you don't, it could be runny or liquidy inside. So you want to let it all set up good. Let it cool down before you cut into it. And you can serve this with whipped cream or ice cream or plain or any other kind of topping that you want to put on it. Some people like it plain. It smells delicious. And it tastes delicious. God bless. Bye-bye.